mute everybody. So for each of my presenters, you'll have to unmute yourself when it's your turn. Here we go, I'm muting everybody. And so I just, it's like the old days. I have to silence my phone.
Stop touching. I wanted to be, oh, Judy, come.
So my name is Amy Janess. I'm programming coordinator at the Nantucket Atheneum. I see a lot of familiar faces tonight. Hello to all of you. I wish we were doing this in the Great Hall. I think it would be even more special, but here we are on Zoom. And so often our programs focus on other people's stories, but every once in a while we like to tell stories of the Atheneum. So I'm excited tonight to present to you 4 stories that have to do with our collections. And I know a lot of you know our history, but I'll just say that in 1834, the Nantucket Atheneum was established by 2 businessmen, Charles G. Coffin and David Joy. They purchased a Unitarian church at the corner of what is now India and Federal Street. That church did burn down in 1847, and the building that's there now replaced it. But when they formed the Nantucket Atheneum, their vision for it was a private membership-only institution where members could take out books. They hosted a lot of lectures and a lot of meetings and gatherings. And they also had a pretty large collection of art and artifacts brought home by Nantucket mariners who were traveling all over the world. So we have some, if you know the building, you'll know there's a lot of art and sculpture on display, but we also have a vault that has some stuff in it that not a lot of people get to see. So tonight, you're going to hear about 4 different things, and I'll leave it at that because I don't want to spoil anything. So the first person who's going to present is Jim Borzilleri. He works in the reference department. And Jim, where are you? You ready? Okay, just give me 1 sec to pull up your PowerPoint. And
okay, and hopefully I pulled myself off mute. This will be a very quick presentation.
Okay, so take it away.
There we go. All right, excellent. All right, good evening, everybody. I am Jim Borzilleri, and I do work in the reference department here at the Nantucket Atheneum. And what I'm going to be doing is talking about James Hathaway, who is an artist active on Nantucket in the 1840s. Now, back in February, we posted a presentation about Hathaway out on YouTube. This talk is adjacent to that with only a slight overlap, so the viewing order won't matter. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, Amy.
Here, for example, is a...
Alrighty. All right, so I'm going to start with this painting by Hathaway. This dates to 1848 when he donated it to the Nantucket Atheneum. I think the subject should look familiar, but this particular image of George Washington should also look familiar. It's so iconic, it was chosen for use on the $1 bill. Okay, Amy, next slide. Now, the original source of this image was a painting executed in the 1790s by an artist named Gilbert Stuart, and that's his original on the right. And at the time, there was a great demand for paintings of George Washington, but there was a limit to how often the president could sit for his portrait. So frequently, the best alternative was owning a good painted copy. Next slide. Amy, next slide. There we go. And the greatest copyist of Gilbert Stuart was Gilbert Stuart himself. George Washington sat for him 3 times, but Stuart painted well over 100 portraits, using the works created during those 3 sittings as his models. And that is one of Stuart's copies that you see on the right, based on the model, the original from the center there. But even the number of Stuart's copies could not meet the demand, so other artists filled in the gap. And a half century later, there was still a market for paintings of George Washington, which brings us to Hathaway and his copy. Okay, Amy, next slide. Now, we know very little about Hathaway's life before 1839, when he probably arrived on Nantucket. We don't know his birthplace for sure. We don't know his age, but a published letter at the time described him as young and promising. So we think he was fairly early in his career. But he certainly came to Nantucket at a perfect moment. The economy was relatively strong. And more importantly, Joseph Swain, who is the established portrait artist already on Nantucket, would soon be leaving to study abroad for 2 years. Next slide. There we go. Thank you. Now, it may have taken Hathaway a little while to get established, but in July 1840, he completed this painting of Mary Hussey Gardner, and we can already see his talent. Mary Gardner's wearing a really warm, friendly expression. I really like this painting. But we also see Hathaway's lack of formal training, particularly in human anatomy. His faces are sometimes compared to those of a porcelain doll. His hands are disproportionately small and sometimes look like little sausages. And for these reasons, Hathaway has sometimes been grouped with what are called the itinerant artists of the time, who also had very little training. Okay, Amy, next slide. But Hathaway continued to improve, and this painting is dated to 1845. And these are the children of Benjamin Coffin, who was his principal patron. And he obviously shows more skill in rendering the faces. It's a much more ambitious pose. And this was executed just as photographic portraits were emerging. And Hathaway seems to be responding to that particular kind of competition because he's presenting a very idealized portrait as opposed to something that might be photographically accurate. In addition, while successfully photographing 3 children and a dog with the equipment available at the time would have been a major challenge. For example, you had to hold your pose absolutely still for at least 20 seconds. Hathaway's composition does just that, and he does it in color. Now, it's said that Hathaway wanted to study in Italy and that Benjamin Coffin paid for a trip in exchange for portraits of his family, but we don't have any solid evidence of that. Okay, next slide. Now, this is dated a little later. We don't know the exact date, but it's clearly somewhere in the late 1840s, and Hathaway's work is even more refined. This is young Albert Ewer on the left, and his father, Prince William Ewer, a Nantucket captain, on the right. Now, even if he didn't make it to Italy, this painting definitely shows that Hathaway has adapted a very strong feel for the colors and the composition of Italian painting. The faces are certainly more realistic and very, very sharply rendered. But oddly enough, the rest of the painting feels kind of flat, almost blurry. If you look at the dog, for example, it almost feels like Albert's face and the dog are from 2 different works. Okay, next slide. Now, in the summer of 1846, as we all know, the Great Fire destroyed many of Nantucket's businesses. Hathaway, like many others, moved away to find work. In the following spring, he is listed for the first time in a Boston commercial directory as a portrait painter. And you can see him there. He was out on Washington Street. Okay, Amy, next slide. And of course, in March of 1848, the following year, he presented his George Washington portrait to the Nantucket Atheneum to help it rebuild its collection after the fire. A newspaper article at the time said that the critics in Boston considered it a particularly good rendering, and it mentions that Hathaway planned to go to Italy later that year. Okay, next slide. Okay, now this is blank for a reason, and that's because Hathaway's narrative usually ends right about here. He just sort of fades into oblivion in the 1850s. About 25 or 30 years ago, there was a wave of research into the artists that had worked on Nantucket. But even then, the consensus was that after 1850, Hathaway's whereabouts were just uncertain. Okay. Next slide, Amy.
You can start screen share all the.
Okay, so all that research was done, as I said, 25 to 30 years ago. And in the decades since, more and more archives and documents have come online. And for example, on its website, the Nantucket Atheneum has digitized its collection of island newspapers going back to the 1820s. And if you go out to our website, this is where you'll see that page. Our collection includes a search engine, so you don't have to look at every single page. And earlier this year, I used it to look for James Hathaway. I had a hunch he might have gone to California during the gold rush, and it was possible that someone from Nantucket, also in California, wrote home about him. Well, as it turns out, I was half right. Amy, you want to go to the next slide? Someone did meet him, but not in California. In April of 1854, Henry Clapp Jr., a native Nantucketer, had just returned from Europe and was giving a series of talks at the Atheneum before he returned to his home in New York. But during those talks, he announced that he had seen Hathaway in Paris, where he was working as a professional copyist at the Louvre Museum and as a successful portrait artist. Okay, next slide. Now, the Louvre requires copyists to apply for permission to work in the museum. And again, a copyist is defined as someone who is making a copy of a painting and selling it, as opposed to a student. And fortunately, the records for their copyists who receive permission includes James Hathaway, and there he is, March 1st, 1849. And later records show that he received this permission for the next 15 years, implying that he continued to live in Paris, at least off and on, until at least 1864. Next slide, Amy. Now, while it was politically volatile, overall, this was a good time to be a copyist in France. The country was ruled for the most part by Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who after a coup in 1851 declared himself emperor. And his government issued a significant number of commissions for copies of paintings of officials, as well as official art and other masterpieces. And this is in addition to the ongoing private demand for copies. And so working copyists and art students filled the Louvre gallery. And you can see from this woodcut by Winslow Homer, set in the late 1860s. Next slide, Amy. Now, Henry Clapp also mentioned that on one occasion, he saw Hathaway copying a painting by the Italian artist Raphael, which kind of makes sense, given that we know he was at least infatuated with the Italian style. And we can't be sure, but this particular painting is a very, very likely one, because as you see it, it's very close to his Nantucket work. You've got someone staring out at the viewer. They're shown almost in a flat kind of plane. And again, you see their hands folded, all of which is characteristic of Hathaway. Okay, next slide, Amy. However, the documents in the Louvre archives also show that in 1856, Hathaway requested permission to complete a copy of this work from the Spanish Baroque. And as you can see, it is very different from what we might think about as a Hathaway. This was probably a commissioned piece, but the fact he was given such a commission suggests that his technical skills had significantly developed by about that time. Now, as I said, there are no records of Hathaway receiving copyist permission after about 1864 in the Louvre Museum, but many of the Louvre's documents after that date are missing or were destroyed. So it's possible he was still working there. We just don't have the records. Next slide, Amy. But if he was still there, outside events may have ended Hathaway's time in Paris a few years later. In 1871, France went to war with Prussia. Paris was put under siege and suffered badly. You can see that from this engraving. France was soundly defeated, and Louis Bonaparte was deposed. And the new government that came into power sharply reduced its commissions for painted copies. Okay, next slide. In addition, in both Europe and America, photographic portraits continued gaining in popularity. So if Stuart's Washington painting was the basis for his image on the $1 bill, Matthew Brady's photograph of Lincoln would become the basis for his image on the $5 bill. And the era of the painted copyists essentially came to an end. Okay, next slide, Amy. All right, so what is the impact of all this new information about Hathaway? Well, for one thing, his George Washington portrait in the Atheneum, rather than being an unusual one-off copy, now seems to mark a transition in his career from an American period to a new European period, which raises the question of, okay, so where are Hathaway's European paintings? Well, after 150 years and 3 wars, many are probably lost and destroyed. His copies were supposed to look like the original artists, which would make them very difficult to identify. And for his portraits, well, the situation there is we just may not recognize them. It's quite possible we have Hathaways in our midst, but he may become so technically skilled, they no longer look like the porcelain doll faces that we associate with Hathaway. So until one turns up, all we can say for certain is that Hathaway's career stretched far beyond that of a typical New England itinerant artist. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jim. So I forgot to say at the beginning that after everybody gives their presentation, we're going to open it up for questions. So feel free to put a question in the chat as we go along, or you're welcome to at the end. But we're just going to roll right through to the next presenter, who is Liz Kelly. She's head of circulation at the Atheneum, and I'm just going to make her the spotlight. Take it away, Liz.
Thank you for having me. I'm just pulling up my presentation here. All right, let's see. Okay, so May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and I felt that it was just appropriate we would highlight some of our Asian and Pacific Islander materials that we have in the vault. Nantucket's ties to Asia are fairly well known just because of the whaling industry and the spice trade, specifically with China, Hawaii, and different parts of Japan and Southeast Asia. Some Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders were actually recruited on some of the whaling voyages and came back to Nantucket either to visit temporarily and go back on another whaling ship, or eventually stay here long term and live in different parts of the Cape and New Bedford. And some of the captains and crew would obviously bring back materials, and that's why the Nantucket Atheneum has come to have various collections from time to time. Before the fire of 1846, the library likely had a lot more materials and artifacts from this time period. Unfortunately, we lost a lot in the fire. So our collection is not very large, but I do think it is significant. The first item that I'm going to talk about is a Chinese Bible. This is the New Testament. We don't have a lot of information on where this came from necessarily in terms of how the Atheneum came to add it to its collection. But we do know from a kind of simple translation of the front matter that it may have come from the Anglo-Chinese College in Hong Kong that was founded in 1818. That school still exists today. It's called the Yinhua College. It's over 200 years old and the oldest school in China, or Hong Kong. And it was established by a missionary in London. So that's as much as we know about this particular material, but it does have really beautiful printing inside. It's a pocket-sized Bible, which makes sense. It may have been brought over at some point in someone's travels, and the Atheneum ended up adding it to its collection. The second item that I have is a Hawaiian Bible. As you can see, the outside has a little wear and tear on it, but the inside is perfectly delightful. This is printing from 1842, also from a missionary publisher in Oahu. And what I thought was interesting about this material is how Hawaii was used as a major port for the whaling voyages and shippers and traders in the Pacific. And there were a lot of exports from Hawaii as well that came back to Nantucket, including sugar, molasses, and salt. Another thing that I thought was kind of interesting about this item was that from time to time, things get lost in translation. And we are pretty grateful these days to have things like Google Translate. Obviously, at that time period, the librarians wouldn't have had a lot of information on how to deal with cataloging these items. And you'll see at the end of this phrase here, this is from the front matter in the Bible itself. And it has a phrase that says Kakawea Manai, but that was misinterpreted and misspelled in the cataloging of it, and it was included as the name of the translator. But when you actually do a translation of this basically title and subtitle of this Bible, this is the matter that you get. And the phrase kakawea is actually means written by, and here it's translated as what is written here. So I just think it's kind of an interesting connection to the library. Sometimes we don't always get it right. But I think this is a really interesting part of our collection, and it's a really beautiful book, as you can see from the inside here. The next item is a Japanese fairy tale book. This is a soft cover book that's actually made out of a crepe paper fabric, and it's bound with silk thread on the edges. This is part of a larger series. This is number 25. Unfortunately, we don't have any others from this collection, but the name is Chin Chin Kobakama. The story is about a young girl who is very lazy and she doesn't want to do any of her chores. And the moral of the story is that these little fairies or goblins come and meet her at night and kind of tease her for not doing her work around the house. And of course, she learns her lesson by the end when they turn into a pile of toothpicks and she has to clean everything up. So these were intended for children, obviously, and that's why they were made out of this fabric material. It was really durable and allowed the reader to use it as many times as possible. With kids, they can open, close it, take it anywhere, and it would stand up to the test of time rather than a printed book. This particular book was designed to be distinctly Japanese, but to have kind of a Western vibe, because over time they were originally intended for children, but they became popular with tourists. So the style of the book itself has very distinctly Japanese illustrations, but a Western structure. And also the text block and the illustrations are separate, which normally in Japanese traditional printing, those would be more integrated. But as you can see from these illustrations, they're really beautiful. There's almost this gradient kind of faded look on some of the pages, and the colors are very vibrant. This was by the T. Hasegawa Publishing Company. We don't have a specific date, but we are trying to figure out through some of the translations and the other versions of this of when it was actually published. I should mention that the first two Bibles, like I said, were kind of added to the collection at some point or another. This particular item and the next one I'm going to show you were printed probably more recently, at least in the modern era, and added to the collection in the last couple of years through a donation. The last item that I have is the new edition flower arrangements of the Ohara School. Flower arranging is a long cultural tradition in Japan, derived originally from China with connections to originally Buddhism. It's considered a very meditative art form, much like their tea ceremonies. This was printed in 1955 by the Tsuchiyama Printing Company. And includes specific information on the instructions for various flower arrangements and the illustrations as well. What's interesting about this book is not just the content, but the way that it's bound together. This is a traditional Japanese style of binding, sometimes known as a concertina binding or an accordion binding. As you can see on the left-hand side, there's no spine on the edge at all. It's just two covers. And the reason for that is the pages are folded together and then glued at the edges, so they make one long strip. And you can see what that looks like here. You can open this book like a traditional codex and read it page to page, or you can actually stretch it out and see all of the illustrations at once. This is an example of what's inside. Again, it includes all of the information of the style that was used, the type of flowers, and the vessel that the arrangement would be placed in. All of this was very specific in terms of how this would be presented, and always had a purpose and a meaning to the person that made it and who it might be given to. So here's another example. As you can see, the colors are really vibrant. This particular copy is very, very beautiful and clean. It has very little damage. It's clearly lasted the test of time. And that is kind of my final slide there, but that's just some of the Asian related materials that we have in our vault collection.
Thank you, Liz. I think what a lot of people don't know is that Liz is also very interested in bookbinding. So I have a feeling that's why that collection appealed to you, but I'm just guessing. So next up is Peter Panchy. Peter, I need you to unmute yourself so your name will pop to the top of the list. There you are. Okay, and let me just pull up your presentation and give me 1 sec here.
Okay, well, as an introduction, I spent about 2 years transcribing old records. The first, at the request, I believe, of the Board of Trustees, there were minutes from trustees and proprietors meetings from about the 1840s to the 1930s. And of course, when I was given this task, foolishly, I started thinking, wow, it's going to be great to find out what people were talking about the Civil War or this and that. And of course, as they should have, these meetings dealt completely with the business of the Atheneum, but there were a few things of especially unique interest, I think, and that's the first was, some people have said, why does the Atheneum have a period at the end of it? And I think I discovered in the original incorporations documents that David Joy submitted to the General Court, that's the way he wrote it, Atheneum period. Another example of things of interest were how the NHA and the Maria Mitchell Association kind of grew cooperatively out of events like the commemorative fundraising for the commemorative portrait of Maria Mitchell after her death, and also many of the exhibits at the early NHA came from what used to be called the museum, which was part of the Atheneum. The other greatest area of interest, although the minutes didn't record much debated discussion, was the process by which the Atheneum became a public library. Having finished with the minutes, I undertook to start transcribing some whaling logs, which quite honestly I think are fascinating. Amy has prepared a couple screenshots of some of the logs. This is just for you to give a quick look at what they might look at. And if you could rotate through those, Amy, I don't expect people to read them, just see the quality that we have, which is greatly variable. This one is from the Argo. And what we hope to do, this is very much a work in progress. There is software out there where what we're hoping to do once the project is completed is show on one side of the page the actual log and then the written translation on the other. The Argo was also interesting because Charles Gardner was the master, but he's sailing out of London. He does 5 voyages from the 1790s to the teens of the 18th century, and they're all from London. And this was fairly common. The crew on the Argo was over half Nantucketers. You want to keep going with those, Amy? The range of the logs I looked at went from 1757 up through 1859 and barely scratches the surface of the log books available both at the Atheneum, and a couple of the Gardner log books were actually loaned to us by the NHA. This is one of the earlier ones I did. There's a series of 5 voyages in the 1750s and 60s, and the record keeper is Peter Folger. Another great change is these early voyages are from 4 to 6 months and go up toward Newfoundland. And of course, voyages later, like the Argo and the Nantucket, exceed 2 years and go into the Pacific Ocean. You can keep them moving, I think, Amy. I was able to complete if you see here, these are all kinds of nautical notations about the course, the wind direction, and adjustments to course, which were very common in the early logs when they really didn't get that far away from shore, quite honestly. I was able to complete 14 logs before COVID and all of that kind of shut it down at the end of 2020. Some of the other people whose logs we had, Folger, Charles Gardner, Obed Fitch, and one woman in 1859, Elmira Gibbs, who was kind of interesting in the sense it's the only one by a woman, but that was fairly common kind of from the 1820s and 30s forward, where the captain's wife would sail with her husband, and she was often the record keeper. Elmira really struggled with the life on board, and it's kind of ironic when she returned home. One of her quotes is, "Some people are made for the sea, some are made for the land," and I strongly think I am of the latter group. She ended up going on another voyage about 2 years later and actually died on that voyage. Elmira was interesting also because she, maybe from a woman's point of view, she was far more likely to express her emotions about the worries of not getting whales. And it's greatly implied that she and her husband would financially be greatly harmed if they didn't have a successful voyage. And frequently in her log, she's worried and expressing that we God disposes and we must make the best of it. Interestingly, on that trip, her son was a cabin boy, and that was kind of the way Nantucket young men started. You'd start at the bottom as a cabin boy or a hand, and hopefully work yourself all the way up to captain. We could keep moving right through those. I just wanted people to take a look. In doing these, as you can see, the legibility varies greatly. The handwriting varies greatly. I think one of the greatest adjustments I had to make was that they're written without punctuation or breaks. My intent was to try in the transcription to make them as close a facsimile of the actual log as possible. The one adjustment I consistently made was trying to parse the thoughts into readable units, because as you can see, it's just like one long run-on sentence. Beyond that, when I found words that I just couldn't possibly read, I bracketed the word illegible. When I made a best guess, or I did not understand the word, the meaning of the word that the letter spelled out, I followed it with a question mark. The conventions of capitalization and spelling were not greatly in force at the time of these logs. So there's a bit of interpretation that goes into that as well. I think the greatest value beyond the stories they tell is that these are tremendous primary sources for students at all levels to learn about the life of whalers and what whaling was about. Over the time period I covered, there are many, many wars that affect the seas during those times. Of course, we have the War of 1812, the Revolutionary War, but also because we were so closely identified with Britain, Britain's at war with France or Spain during these times too. And these whaling ships would get pursued and fired at by enemy combatants. At one point off the coast of Mexico, I can't remember which ship, it might have been the Nantucket, but they're very, very low on water and they're trying to get into a port to get water and get chased by a Spanish ship and aren't able to. Luckily, they run into another whaler at sea and who's willing to share water with them. These interactions at sea are quite interesting. You know, they have gams, they catch up on news and share any letters or newspapers they might have. For Elmira Gibbs, the chance to see other women was of great importance to her, but also how incredibly self-sufficient these ships were as far as utilizing their supplies. Certainly in the 18th century, they took a lot of livestock on board so that to keep their diet as healthy as possible. But the ongoing need to repair the whale boats after they're stove and sometimes destroyed, the enormous amounts of lumber that they must have on board for the trying of the whale and converting it to oil. Not to mention the danger. The other part of life at sea that I really found very touched by is you have these tremendous periods of flurries of activity and the high adrenaline of actually whaling. But these long periods, as they would say, dull times, saw nothing, no whales. This would especially get Elmira Gibbs. And there were times when I put in a couple of hours transcribing that when I'd shut off the machine, I would feel with a great sigh like I was getting off the ship after an unproductive period. There were mutinies, there were troubles with individual sailors who sometimes one gentleman, or I guess he wasn't a gentleman, but he got a cut and an infection in his leg, and obviously it caused him to become delusional, and he is so upset when, because he's sick, the captain restricts and forbids his grog portion, that he physically attacks the captain and is put in irons. So although there's these long, dry periods, there's an awful lot of life on board to be enjoyed. And as I said, I think as this project is completed and we're able to provide some auxiliary materials such as maps and some lexicons and historical context for the years of those voyages, I think they will become invaluable resources for students of whaling. And once the Atheneum is open again, you can check with Lincoln or Jim as to if there's access to what is already done or when they will be, I guess the word is, published for more extensive use. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Peter. So our final speaker tonight is Laura Pless Freedman. Laura works on the circulation desk, but volunteered to do a little research project. And so let me just make you the spotlight. There you are. Hi, Laura. And you start talking and I will share your PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Amy. Hi, everybody. I recognized a few faces. It's nice to see some of my patrons out there. And I'm very happy to be here. I've been thinking about this treasure in the vault for a few years now, so it's nice that I can share it. While reading The Yellow House by Sarah Broom this year, it was the One Book, One Island choice, I was struck by her complex relationship to her childhood home. And all the people she shared with it, living and deceased. She had many siblings. I think she came from 12. And oh, next slide, Amy, thanks. She came from a big family, and she had adolescent longings for escape. She wanted to escape the crumbling walls, escape family obligations. The Yellow House stifled her, but it also nurtured her in equal measure. Next slide, Amy. As a teenager, Sarah Broom, she felt ashamed of the physical condition of her house, but realized later in life that she never felt the same sense of belonging anywhere else. She grew up and moved away to pursue a career in writing, and she took the house with her, whether it was in a yellow tablecloth in her kitchen or maps of New Orleans on the walls. She always kind of brought a piece of a Yellow House with her. And even before Hurricane Katrina, next slide, Amy, ravaged her family's home, she dreamed of the Yellow House. She just seemed to carry it with her. In the book, she poses a question, which was on one of the earlier slides. And it really got me thinking. It's, who has the rights to the story of a place? Are these rights earned, bought, fought, and died for? Or are they given? The Yellow House had been given to her as a kind of inheritance. The physical house was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. We all remember that day, at least I do. And then, of course, the levees broke, so it really flooded her home. The physical house was destroyed, but the inheritance was the same. 4121 Wilson Ave in the east section of New Orleans was deemed by some too young to have history. But it's a house that maybe we can all remember in some form. Close your eyes and think about a house that you loved, a house where your being was integral to its fabric. Next slide, Amy. For me, it's 6332 Martin Drive, a 50s style red ranch house with a 1-car garage and tidy lawn. I remember visiting after living on Nantucket, 10, 15, 20 years, and saying to my father on that visit, it's so green here. The trees are so big. It just smelled so good to me. He smiled. He knew I was home and I would always be welcome there, whether the house stood there or not. So it got me thinking that, we all have a Yellow House, a special house that we take with us. Next slide, Amy. So this question of ownership of place got me thinking of the historic Elihu Coleman house on Nantucket. I was fortunate to visit in the winter of 2018. The Elihu Coleman house on Hawthorne Lane is the only house left standing from the old town of Sherburne, when our harbor was, up near the water tower. And, life was very different. It's a salt box style with a magnificent southern exposure and is an excellent example of 18th century architecture. Next slide, Amy. It was built in 1722 by Elihu Coleman, a Quaker carpenter, and his wife Jemima. The house was home to many generations of the Coleman family. Next slide, Amy. Elihu Coleman was a fourth-generation landowner on Nantucket. His great-grandfather was Thomas Coleman, an English immigrant living in Newbury, who'd been selected as one of 10 proprietors that purchased the island in 1637. Elihu Coleman not only left this historic house, it's a beautiful house, I don't know, I think I've dreamed about it, to his family for many generations, but he left us the wisdom and bravery of his powerful testimony that no man should be enslaved. While researching him, I read Thomas E. Drake's book, Elihu Coleman, Quaker Anti-Slavery Pioneer of Nantucket. And he says in his book that Coleman had an inheritance of deep religious feeling, a consciousness of the will of God made manifest in his own heart, and a compelling necessity to bear witness to this light within. Next slide, Amy. When I entered this house in 2018, I knew nothing of Elihu Coleman's 1730 anti-slavery publication. Next slide, Amy. This publication, titled A Testimony Against That Anti-Christian Practice of Making Slaves of Men, wherein it is shrewd to be contrary to the dispensation of the law and time of the gospel, and very opposite both to grace and nature. This pamphlet immediately engulfed my thoughts, just how I felt when I was in this house here. I don't know, it really had a welcoming spirit. You could feel the rich history in the walls. Where I expected to find dark corners, I saw only sunlight. Next slide, Amy. A large fireplace, entirely taking over the middle of the house, was not looming, but somehow inviting. The stairs going straight up at a dizzying pitch had the wear on them of many happy generations. The house, sparsely furnished, seemed to be a portal to another time. And indeed, it was a portal to another time for me. Next slide, Amy. It offered me a chance to learn the history of a remarkable man. And while returning to work the following Monday, I discovered we had 2 copies of Elihu Coleman's testimony in our collection at the Atheneum. And I think they're true treasures in the vault. So we can scroll through the next 2 slides. While photographing these, the paper is very thin. It doesn't have a lot of heft to it, but the text is very bright. So I was happy to see that. This small, unassuming pamphlet dated 1825 is the second printing of the original work published in 1733. Our copies include a preface by Elihu Coleman himself, and it gives the reader a very clear insight as to why he felt compelled to write his testimony. He's quoted as saying, "I was very desirous that I might come to know the Lord myself. I came to see my religion, the religion of a man's education, was not the religion of his, but of them that educated him. While Coleman felt he could join his friends and family, the Quakers, and believe them to be of good principles, he confessed the need to speak against an evil that lived in some of them, this evil being slavery. Next slide, Amy. He wrote that though it was hard to speak and write against this practice that has been carried on so long, he noted in his preface that he not only was the only sober man that had spoken against slavery, he talked about William Burling of Long Island in 1718, Ralph Sandiford of Philadelphia in 1729. They were like-minded, like him, outspoken Quakers, not afraid to speak what was their inner light. Coleman strongly addresses the reader that he cannot stand idly by when he sees oppression and cruelty. He said, and I quote, "He must dwell nearest the truth." Coleman's text refers to scripture repeatedly, and it is the golden rule that he refers to most often: to do to others as they should do to us. He calls out his kin that they may have forgotten God in their times of ease. Coleman further observes, when God had created man, that he gave him a free will and would not compel the will of man, not to that which was good, much less to that which was evil. Therefore, we ought not to compel our fellow creatures. In Coleman's judgment, everything ought to be looked upon according to the importance. He did not think a person could be very zealous in a small thing and to pass lightly over a greater. Slavery was too great a sin in his mind to be passed over. Coleman repeatedly calls out his fellow man that believes that they did wrong in getting slaves, but are not chaste or brave enough to free them for fear of financial repercussions. He's quoted as saying in the pamphlet, "Keeping slaves and being silent encourages others to get them." Coleman ends his testimony with a stark warning to his fellow man: God will not forgive what is in our power to help. This treasured book that we keep at the Nantucket Atheneum is a true inheritance, not just for the Coleman family, but for all of Nantucket and beyond. I found these words so thoughtfully and faithfully given. I pictured Elihu Coleman in his light-filled house on Hawthorne Lane in 1729, and I think it represents the best in us. And I felt it was a privilege to spend time with Elihu Coleman 292 years later. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Laura. That was beautiful. I love the way you wove together the idea of home and house with Elihu Coleman. It was great.
Oh, thanks, Amy.
So those are our presentations for the evening, and we'd love to answer any questions that people have. You can put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask, whichever you'd like to do. Let me take a look in the chat, and actually, I'm going to unspotlight Laura.
Here, Amy, what we can do is I can spotlight all the speakers so we can see them and we won't be overwhelmed by the many people that came to enjoy this. So,
okay, sounds good.
Let me work on that.
All right, so let's look at the chat, see if we have any questions. So someone wants to know if it's possible to see the manuscripts that Liz highlighted in her talk. Liz, do you want to take that one?
In terms of, is that something someone could see at the library, or did they want to see them again on screen?
I'm guessing see in person at the library, but it's not super clear.
Okay, I'll answer that as if that's the question. If someone has a follow-up, that's fine. The books that I showed, I assume would be available to view at some point if when the library is back up and running at some point. But under normal circumstances, yes, those would be available to view and use if somebody was doing research, or if they just would like to view them from the archives. We could make an appointment in the future when that happens.
And actually, I have a question. The last piece that you showed, the Japanese book that's like an accordion, is that a normal way to present books in Japanese culture at the time, or is it a special thing, or they only do it certain circumstances?
So it is a traditional Japanese binding. There's a certain term for it, but it's also called a butterfly binding in Japan. And it's kind of considered something between a scroll and a traditional Western codex, which is the book as we know it. Obviously, scrolls were very difficult to store, and traditional Western style codex books are difficult to make. So this type of book was something in the middle that, as you could see, was really great for both display and for reading purposes, because it does open flat and read like a traditional book if you'd like to.
Yeah, very cool. Well, I won't hog the spotlight here. Let's hear some questions.
I have a question.
Okay.
Would it not be possible to make copies of the Coleman book in a facsimile kind of edition relatively inexpensively, so that could in fact be sold by the Atheneum? I think there are many, many people, particularly in these days, who would be interested, if not fascinated, particularly when you consider the date of that work.
Oh, I agree with you. I actually, while I was researching to see if anybody had the original 1733 publication, and I believe the NHA does have a copy of that, which is unbelievable to me. But I went to the other extreme. I went to Amazon, and they even had copies of it on Walmart to buy as a paperback. So I thought, wow, okay, this word is still getting out, when you read it, if you read it just a couple times in a row, it's just, it's astounding when you realize how many years it was written ago, and how, at least in my mind, it just makes perfect sense. And, it was just such an elegant argument. And I have found it online if you're here on us with Zoom. So there are copies. UMass has copies that you can just click on a link and just read it as if you were, someone had photocopied it for you. So I'm happy to put a few of those links on when we put this on our YouTube channel.
Thank you.
John Rivera has his hand up.
Yep.
That's very nice of you, very polite. What is your question?
A simple question. Where is the vault? Where is the vault actually located?
It's in the Great Hall in the back western corner.
Okay. Good to know. You hit a vault, it's like the Jack Benny vault. It's down past the mall, past the alligators, over the drawbridge. So, thank you for telling me. Thank you.
You are welcome. Any other questions?
I have a question. If each of you were to do this again, what's piqued your interest as you were kind of picking through the vault? What might you do next? Don't all speak at once.
Oh, well, I'll take that one. There's a poem about the legend of Wawinit, and it was composed by a woman, and she actually was a painter. But she kind of reimagined, the Native Americans on the island. It was kind of split east and west, and she kind of turned it into, a man and a woman fall in love together and bring the warring tribes together. So that's kind of piqued my interest. And so I might get that out of the vault as soon as I can go back in there. Or Jim.
I would say we have barely scratched the surface of the available log books, and my guess is as we take the time to read through them, there could be some really fascinating stories to be learned from these. And as I said, I can't think of a finer primary source way for people to learn about whaling.
I ran into, I believe it's a little scrapbook or a pamphlet of a student from the Coffin school, and it was all of her sewing samples. So all the different things, little sewing samples and techniques that she was learning. Each page was a different style. So there was a little one for a miniature apron, and there just wasn't quite enough substance there to dive into that topic, but that's something I would explore in the future.
And I guess for me, it was the discovery of Frederick Sanford's journals from his time in San Francisco. We think of Sanford as the Pacific Bank president, as well as a patron of the Atheneum, but he was actually out in California during the gold rush, working for several of the major clipper firms. And he bequeathed to the library his accounting journals, which you'd think would be dull as dirt. But it's amazing who passes through that book. I mean, he was just kind of connected with everybody. But, you know, that's going to take a certain amount of digging into. And just, you know, I think I tracked something like 62 ships that were mentioned, half of which I can't even identify. So I'm sure he scrubbed it. I don't think we're going to find anything particularly, you know, notorious in it. But it's just sort of interesting because it gives you an insight into just how crazy the money was in California at that point.
Sanford makes a little cameo appearance in the book Barons of the Sea in San Francisco as
Yep.
And I was like, hey, I know who he is.
Yep. Yeah, he said that's the one time he appears in the press. Of outside of a few whaling postings that he gave, like, you know, here's an update I heard from this whale ship. He clearly was one of these people that kept as low a profile as he could keep for someone who is as connected as he was.
A good Nantucketer.
Absolutely. I think that's what Charlie Lowe in that quote said. I think he said something like he's a true Nantucketer, a real driver. So, or I think he said a real Nantucket man.
Yeah.
Actually, frantically searching YouTube because Jim actually did a talk about Sanford. I'm going to see if I can find it and I'll put it in the chat.
And someone else asked if Laura would put a link to a published version of Elihu Coleman's manuscript in the chat. If you have a minute to just copy
Sure.
the Walmart or Amazon or whatever. But I know they're out there. I've seen them. Well, it's 8:06, so we have time for one more question if anybody has one, or final thoughts from the speakers. Speak now, put it in the chat, let us know.
Thank you for everything. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, John.
Thank you.
For reminding me. I appreciate these gatherings. I miss being at the actual building, so I enjoy this.
Good.
And hi, Peter.
Hey, John.
Miss our meeting.
All right, well, the chat is full of happy people saying thank you, which is very nice. But I don't see any more questions. Oh, wait. No. So I think we'll conclude things here. And I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank the 4 speakers for their time and attention. And I hope we can do this again with another round of Treasures from the Vault.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
At all.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Well done.
that hurt.